All right, I think we can start. Great. Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar, special webinar with our special guest, Jim Manico. Okay, so before I introduce him, the topic for today is how do you move from traditional DAST to modern API scanners? And it's a topic close to my heart. I'll talk about, how this topic happened. And yeah, before we start, let's move on to the agenda. Some introduction. We'll talk about what is a traditional DAST, limitations of traditional DAST, what's a modern API scanner, a checklist for it. How do you choose between a traditional DAST and modern API scanner? And we'll give you a bit of demo on Akto, how Akto is solving this problem, and Q&A, of course. Guys, there is a chat over here. You can continue to chat, ask any questions that you have. There's also a poll. You want to answer the poll, please do. Engage in the discussion, ask as much as you ask, we'll be able to answer, right here in the webinar itself. We don't have to, we can type also, but we'll answer your questions as much as possible in the chat. All right, so our guest here, Jim Manico. He's Akto's advisor, and of course, everyone knows him. He doesn't need any introduction. He's the former OWASP Global Board Member. He's CEO of Manico Security. He's been in the industry for, I think, more than 18 years, if I know. He's everything about AppSec. He does a lot of work with OWASP in terms of cheat sheets, and I think recently he published something on cheat sheet for developers, right? Like for secure coding. So he's amazing. He's been with us for last 1.5 years. He's an amazing guy to work with, amazing advisor, and everything that you want to know about AppSec, I think he has it. So welcome, Jim. Thank you. Thanks for being on this webinar.
And Ankita, I'm equally a big fan of you. I hear about you through the different channels in the industry and the work you're doing on API security. I'm a big fan, not just working with you, but what I hear about you from all of my secret channels. I hear lots of good stuff about your work. So it's a pleasure to be here, very much so.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Jim. You're being kind. Thank you. All right. Of course, host is me. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Akto. What is Akto? For people who are new to Akto, it's an API security platform in your DevSecOps pipeline. If you're looking to build an enterprise-grade API security program, Akto is the place to be. We serve companies such as Fortune 500 companies, banks, fintechs, headquartered in SF, backed by leading investors like Axel, Alumni Ventures, of course, advisory from Jim over here, Synax CTO, and so on. Okay, so let's move on to the topic. And Jim, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring you in some of these discussions because you have a lot of knowledge around this, being former OWASP Global Board Member as well. So what is traditional DAST? Guys, DAST, so this definition is taken from OWASP itself. It's a black box testing method. What it does is it tests applications in running state by interacting with their exposed interfaces. So you must have seen some open source DAST. You must have seen the commercial DAST as well. What you really do is you input a web URL. It interacts with the application, does attacks from an external perspective, from an external attacker perspective, and finds vulnerabilities. And to just to show you how it does so, there's a diagram over here. It sort of gets the URL, does some attacks, and creates a report in form of a XML HTML report. And it does so by making some HTTPS request and analyze the responses. Now, what kind of what has been the success in past of DAST in traditional web apps? It's commonly used for vulnerabilities such as XSS, SQL injection, CSRF, and it's very good at it. It's actually very good at finding these injection vulnerabilities, and it has been used, I think, for last more than 20 years in the past. For traditional web apps. Now, when I say traditional web apps, what it means is it's like monolithic applications, right? These are contained in a single unit with clear boundaries. So DAST is very good at doing that. There are some success stories over here. It's especially SQL injection. If you're using a DAST for XSS flaws, if you're using a DAST, you will be able to sort of find those vulnerabilities. So it's got some widespread adoption. It's a very useful tool for traditional web apps. And but there's a lot of change happening now in the industry, now in just in terms of how applications are built, right? It's not traditional web apps anymore. These are like developers are building modern applications. These are not monolithic architecture. These are microservices now. So there's rise of APIs. There is microservices that are being built. What does that mean? What that means is the applications have become complex. They are more API heavy applications, which means the traditional DAST, which is not very API heavy, which does not, cannot do a lot of API scanning, does not work for modern applications as well. It works for monolithic applications, but not really for modern microservices architecture application. So there are some limitations. And I think before I talk about it, I want some perspective from Jim over here. You've seen, Jim, in the last 20 years in the industry, how the web applications have changed from the traditional monolithic architecture to microservices. How has that changed AppSec? How has that changed security testing? How has that changed DAST? I think I want that view from you.
Well, think of how we used to communicate with the web app. Like I'd have a browser, I'd make a request to a web app, which would talk to a backend database or other data structures, and I get a response. And that's how the basic communication flow with web applications worked for a long time. Today, I might make a request to a web app, and that's going to hit some kind of proxy server, which is going to hit a microservice that talks to another microservice that talks to another microservice, and then sends a response back down the chain to me. And so if I just had a web app with the database, the traditional DAST technology is mature when it's assessing those kind of applications. And even in that case, DAST has its limits. But in a microservice architecture, DAST tends to break down, especially when you're talking about intranet microservices that are part of a request chain. And the reason why I'm a big fan of Akto and the API security space is because I really need to take a look at traffic between internal microservices to get a complete picture of how that application is working and how to do security assessment against the application. Again, intra-service communication, and traditional SAST, as it stands, doesn't really give me visibility into that kind of architecture these days.
Got it. Yes, agreed. And I think you've brought in a very good point, Jim, over here, that there's no visibility into the traffic. There's lack of context. The traditional DAST cannot understand the new architecture, the APIs, the API traffic, right? So these are really the limitations of DAST, which is one, it lacks context. It's a black box testing tool, so it tries to scan the tool, but it does not have the context of the APIs, the context of the microservices. So that's the number one limitation. The second is it's very good for, as I said, injection attacks, XSS, SQL injection, and all of those. But and there are limitations there as well. But if you really want to do authentication, authorization testing, or any kind of sophisticated testing on APIs, it has huge limitations. You won't be able to do it. It won't be able to understand API auth schemes such as JWT, OAuth, if it's behind social login and stuff like that. It's very hard for DAST to do that. Configuration. So, and this is something that I've heard more in conversations rather than me using the tool. I've heard like the biggest challenge is there is a lot of configuration required for a DAST to function, right? So that's very, very hard, very, very challenging. And even after configuration, the results are not that great for especially API-driven architecture. So that's a big limitation. And that's why like the very reason we are doing this topic, we are doing a webinar on this topic is in the last 3-4 months, there have been so many conversations I've been part of where people are trying to move from traditional DAST to API scanners. And they're struggling with understanding how to differentiate between these two. They know they have challenges with traditional DAST, but they cannot, quantify what should they look for if not traditional DAST. What is that modern API scanner? How should they evaluate a modern API scanner? What should they, what is that futuristic plan for next 2 years, 5 years, and so on? And that's why we are doing this. In terms of API coverage also, every DAST I have seen covers mostly REST APIs. Hardly I've seen some DAST covering GraphQL. So that's a big challenge as well. And a lot of companies today are building not just REST, they have like multiple API protocols like GraphQL, gRPC. SOAP has been traditional, of course, but I'm seeing a lot of WebSockets as well. So that's something most of the DAST don't cover. They cover mostly REST. So these are major limitations of DAST. And I think I'll talk about the security blind spots, and we talk about it, right? DAST covers SQL injection and most XSS and all of those vulnerabilities. What is blind spot? Blind spot is things that it's not under the purview of DAST. It's just hard for DAST to do because they just don't have that API context, that context of the traffic. So these are categorized by OWASP top 10. Authentication flaws, BOLA, mass assignment, injection attacks. It does, but some of the injection attacks like GraphQL injection and especially on APIs, it's very hard for DAST to do. Broken function level authorization, where you want a user one should not be able to access the data and APIs of other user. So that's broken function level authorization, very hard for DAST to do. Rate limiting flaws, improper asset management. Now this one is very big on both OWASP API top 10 and web top 10, which is having an inventory of APIs. Now that DAST doesn't have because it just doesn't have the traffic. So these are the blind spots of DAST. And before I move on, and I think I want some, I would love some perspective from Jim over here. You've seen probably the blind spots of DAST, some knowledge over there.
I mean, the whole world of auth, both authentication, session management, and access control flaws, DAST really struggles with because it doesn't have the context of understanding like the business rules that you need to even verify access control. And what a lot of the DAST tools do, they'll give me the ability to program in my policy to look to be able to scan. And this is a real burden to like even begin to leverage that kind of functionality. So just in general, access control is brutally hard for DAST to test, especially when those rules get complicated. And authentication has only gotten more and more complicated over the last many years. We now see things like OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect, and now JSON Web Tokens and new forms of session management. And just the general complexity of all the different steps in a modern authentication flow is really difficult for modern DAST, and for that matter, to some degree, modern SAST to assess in an even reasonable way. So just our tools are good in the industry. It's just that the complexity of apps and the architecture changes are so dramatic. The things that we depended on only a couple of years ago are not thorough enough for today's environment.
Yeah, it's such a great point that you've brought, Jim, that tools are good, but the applications have become so complex. The architecture has become so complex that it's very hard for any SAST, DAST, API scanner to cover everything and cover all kinds of complexity and all. So it's what you want to do as a buyer or as somebody who's evaluating AppSec tools. It's you can't, of course, get everything because the architecture is becoming complex, but you want to have a checklist sort of that you cover bare minimum. And you want to invest in a tool that's more futuristic, that has the potential to cover that those complexities. So I think that's pretty critical, and it's a very good point. I see something in chat. Yeah, other than would DAST for mobile apps rather than web apps have the same challenges? Does Akto have any mobile use cases? Yeah, so let me come back on this. I'll answer a lot of questions around here. Piers, let me go to the webinar, because I think a lot of your questions will get answered over here. All right, so we covered limitations of traditional DAST. What is traditional DAST? What are the security blind spots of traditional DAST? Now let's move on to how do we move to modern API scanners, and what exactly are modern API scanners? Are they only delta different from DAST, or they are significantly better? How do you think about it from your AppSec strategy perspective? So yeah, let's dive into this. What is a modern API scanner? Now, modern API scanner, it's a tool that's very specifically designed to detect and fix vulnerabilities in APIs. Now, when I say APIs, these are REST, GraphQL, SOAP, gRPC, WebSocket, all types of APIs. And these are specifically built for modern architecture, microservices architecture. So how it works, few things that you want a modern API scanner to have. One is very, very important thing is real-time API traffic analysis. Now, the reason why DAST has limitations is it does not have complete context of APIs. It does not have complete context into what is happening in the application. It's the traffic analysis capabilities and so on. So that's the number one thing that you want to have in a modern API scanner. Automated API testing. So automatically can the tool generate API security test automatically and execute them without much configuration. Context. You need the tool to have context, business logic context, understand from the traffic how the API graph works, which service is calling which other service, how the input of one API is going into the, how the output of one API is going into the input of other API, and so on. Active testing coverage, for example, BOLA, mass assignment, injection attacks, authentication attacks, and literally the whole OWASP API top 10 list is a very good place to start with. It's not a small list. It's actually a very comprehensive list. If you can cover that, if a modern API scanner can cover that, it covers a lot. Yeah, so this fifth one is actually pretty important, because what has happened is, especially in the last few years, yes, everyone is talking about shift left and DevSecOps, and that has been there, and especially SAST has adopted that very well, static analysis tools. But for DAST, for API scanners, it's not been there so much. But what I'm seeing now is everyone is trying to move towards, how do we integrate our modern DAST or our modern API scanners in the CI/CD tooling? And it's pretty important, guys. Like if you're doing release testing, if you're doing, weekly, monthly releases and so on, you want that ability. You want that ability to integrate your scanners in the CI/CD pipeline, and you want to look for this kind of capability in your API scanner. So that's a modern API scanner. Basically traffic routing to the testing, and all APIs getting discovered, and all the alerts and the integrations happen in the CI/CD pipeline. So that's the kind of modern API scanner you're looking for. That is a modern API scanner. Some differences between traditional DAST versus modern API scanner. I've talked about what traditional DAST is, what modern API scanner is. Big differences are, of course, DAST is more focused on monolithic architecture. Modern API scanners, API heavy architecture. The scanning approach is very different. This one, DAST is very black box testing, while API scanners, it's not black box. It's because they know the traffic, because it's almost like sitting inside and like really having the context of APIs. So it's not black box at all. The coverage for DAST is more HTML based web apps. It's for modern API scanners, it's all types of APIs. So these like authentication support, as I mentioned, API scanners should have full understanding of the authentication authorization flaws. Real-time analysis is something that DAST doesn't have, API scanners have. CI/CD integration. Manual configuration is a big one, guys. So most of the times, as I mentioned, DAST requires a lot of manual configuration. Even for API scanning, a DAST needs open API spec file. Now, this is extremely important for somebody who's evaluating a modern API scanner. For a modern API scanner to work, it should not require you to supply a URL or to, give an open API spec file. A modern API scanner should be able to understand the API context through traffic itself. It should be able to generate its own API spec file and not require user to input it. And that really differentiates DAST from an API scanner.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll open it for Jim to give some thoughts on the differences and what do you think of modern API scanners?
I think the thing that really excites me about some of the modern API scanner tech that I'm seeing is the ability to like introspect on traffic. That's the big differentiating factor. Like even just for threat modeling, a lot of us in threat modeling, we're building diagrams of how API works based on like conversation with developers. But when I'm using like a modern API scanner and I'm able to like inspect intra-service traffic and similar, I can auto-generate diagrams or at least know exactly how that API is working in the real world. And it enables not just security assessment, but it gives me visibility for other areas of application security. This is really exciting. And like I've only seen, different companies actually providing this kind of capability in the last couple of years. And it really changes the game when I'm trying to do security assessment of a microservice architecture. So yeah, that for me is it. Like the real-time traffic monitoring as part of the assessment process is amazing.
Yeah, this thing, right? Yeah, it actually changes the game, the real-time monitoring, but that is the exact thing a DAST is lacking. And if it lacks it, it just cannot do that contextual testing. And this is exactly what differentiates a modern API scanner from a DAST. So what you're looking for is an ability to actually get real-time API traffic for your testing. All right, so since it's an Akto webinar, we'll talk more about how Akto can
Right
solve.
on. Sounds reasonable. I'm with you.
Yeah, we'll talk about how Akto can solve your modern API scanning needs, and I'll give a bit of demo also how Akto can do this. But everything that we talked about, what a modern API scanner should have, real-time traffic monitoring, a big rule set of API security test library, which the attack scenarios basically that your API security testing tool should be able to do. Traffic-based testing. Now, and I mentioned this earlier, not relying on open API spec files for testing, but actually using the traffic that Akto has or the dashboard has for testing by itself. Is a real big winner, guys. If you're using open API spec file for testing, the results are going to be very low hanging fruit. It's not going to give you much. It's authentication authorization testing is extremely hard on open API spec file because it just doesn't have the sample values. It's the APIs are not completely covered. The key values are mostly always not updated. So this is a key. Of course, context-aware scanning because it has traffic information. AI-powered detection because there's a lot of traffic, there's a lot of data, then we can use LLM to do API scanning. Integration in CI/CD, of course, and API coverage. So Akto covers REST, GraphQL, gRPC, and SOAP, these 4 protocols. So if you have multiple applications, if you have and I think I've talked to teams, even if from mid-market to large enterprises, everyone these days have REST, gRPC, GraphQL. So if you have that kind of those kind of API protocols, then Akto can totally support you. Okay, 2-minute demo of what Akto can do. Let me show you what. So we discussed about API traffic analysis, API security testing, and I'll give you a brief of how Akto can solve those problems. Akto discovers your APIs first through traffic analysis. And for the traffic analysis, if you go to Quick Start, Akto has multiple traffic connectors such as Kubernetes daemon set, eBPF connector, and this is our most popular connector, API gateways, mirroring, AWS services, Azure services, SDKs. We also just released something which is called as API discovery from source code, so we can discover your APIs from source code itself. Now, what these traffic connectors are doing is these traffic connectors are listening to the traffic, your staging or production traffic, and trying to make sense out of these traffic and discovering APIs by listening to these traffic. So once Akto listens to the traffic, it discovers all the APIs over here by host name. You can go to any of these host names and see all of your APIs. Let me go into one of my demo collection. Imagine this is one of your services. I'm using Juice Shop. You'll be able to see all of your API traffic over here. You'll be able to see lots of good information from traffic. Now, what Akto has done is it's got all the API inventory just from traffic monitoring and traffic analysis. We haven't supplied any OpenAPI spec file or Postman collection over here. And that's the beauty of a modern API scanner. It does not need OpenAPI spec file. It will just work through your traffic. Now, what you want to do is you want to run test. You want to run test on all your APIs. So Akto comes with its own test library. It's built in-house. It is the largest API security test library. What it means is it has lots and lots of test scenarios. On the right, you can see like broken authentication. We have 92 test cases. Broken function level authorization. We have like 7 test cases. Broken object level authorization. We have about 23 test cases and so on. So this has like the most comprehensive test library you will not be able to see in traditional DAST tools. And that's what sets Akto apart. What you can do is you can configure these tests. You can add your own test. For example, I've added one of my custom tests over here. You can select run type. You can put it in CI/CD, or you can say, I want to continuously run tests whenever I see an API change. Yeah, I can select time if I'm doing a daily testing at 5 a.m. I can do all of these configuration. I can select a test role if I'm doing authorization testing. So I can say attacker token, and I can click on run. Once I run the test, Akto will be able to show you all the results here. For example, for Juice Shop, we ran the test and we found all of these vulnerabilities. Some of these are JWT non-algo, broken authentication, broken authorization, open redirect, and so on. Now, guys, these vulnerabilities, this is something that only a modern API scanner can do because it's very dependent on API traffic. You will not be able to find these kind of vulnerabilities through a DAST tool. For example, the approach that Akto took, it's not taking an OpenAPI spec file. It's just taking the API traffic and replaying it by changing the request. So for example, this was the request that Akto had seen in API traffic, in staging traffic. It replayed the request to do JWT non-algo attack by changing the authorization token to JWT non-algo. And it saw in response 200 OK plus a lot of good data. So it just didn't rely on the 200 OK response. It also saw some good data, because of which it marked this attempt as vulnerable and marked this API endpoint as vulnerable to JWT non-algo. Now, this is a very different approach from a DAST approach because it's relying on API traffic. It knows the API traffic and it can do those sophisticated tests, which a DAST tool cannot do. And I'm showing you JWT non-algo, but you can do as sophisticated testing as, finding out if a user one can do access the API endpoints and data of user 2, which the user should not be able to do, access control issues, RBAC issues, and so on. So that's Akto. I don't want to go too much into the demo, but this is how a modern API scanner should work. I'll go back to this and
Keita, do you want to answer a couple questions that we have in chat here? Or?
Yes, let me do that.
I have two. One from Luca was asking, how does it work to do traffic monitoring, right? Does it have to work as a reverse proxy, or how can it intercept TLS connections and similar? He's asking more information on how is the traffic inspection done. I gave him a short answer that there's a lot of different connector technologies you can choose from. But you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I agree. We have a lot of connectors, but it's a very good question. We don't do proxy. We do so for mutual TLS, and I'm assuming you're talking about mutual TLS traffic. We have something called as eBPF. eBPF works on Linux kernel, and it pretty much intercepts all the traffic. It does not matter if it is mutual TLS or not. Now, if you don't have mutual TLS, which I think most companies don't, very few companies have mutual TLS, especially in staging. API gateways work very well. Kubernetes daemon set work very well. In fact, like eBPF is actually our most popular connector. It's the technology that people really prefer. So that should be able to get intercept traffic. It's not sitting in line. It is listening to the traffic. There is no impact on performance at all. So that's how Akto is listening to traffic. Yeah.
One more question. Thomas asks, how does Akto test rate limiting flaws? If so, how does it do it without crashing the server? He's nervous about that test.
That is very true. It's hard to do. We do have some rate limiting tests over here. Let me just figure out which ones. Yeah. So we have all of these denial of service tests, and like we have 49 rate limiting tests. You're very right, Thomas. It's hard to do if especially in staging, we'll have to whitelist our IP and so on. And I am guessing you might already have an environment where you can do stress testing and stuff like that. That's the place where Akto can do rate limiting test, but it really depends on case by case basis. For example, denial of service this test is actually meant to do like lot of really bring your server down. So this has to be done with care, but we handle it on basis of what the client request is. So yeah, so that's it's if you have that kind of a request, we can totally take it. Yeah, you don't want to do it on production data at all. You want to do it on staging. You want to do it in an environment which is meant for stress testing. All right.
Good answer.
Okay, so
you want to do one more quick question from Kamal?
Yeah.
Akto covers gRPC, as gRPC is a binary protocol. Does it require any manual settings after the traffic API is discovered at all? You want to talk a little about?
Not at all. No, not at all. So gRPC discovery will work as good as REST API discovery, SOAP discovery, and GraphQL discovery. You're right. gRPC is a binary protocol, but you don't need to do manual configuration or anything at all. If you do any of these traffic connectors, if it's gRPC API call, we'll be able to discover gRPC. And actually what we do is also, if let's say you have multiple types of API protocols, REST, GraphQL, gRPC, SOAP, we'll be able to tell you, your gRPC APIs are 10, REST are 20, GraphQL is 30, and so on. So in short, the answer is no manual configuration required. All right. Yeah.
Awesome.
So, okay. So I think, the checklist now, and I'm bringing, and I really wanted to bring this is because everyone is asking me, hey, I want to move to traditional DAST, but what is like a modern API scanner? How do I evaluate it? What is a checklist that I need? And I think you can take a screenshot. I'll send this PPT also to everyone who has attended. But this is what your checklist should be. You don't, of course, it's the application you're talking about. It is very complex, so you can't have everything. I mean, there are some good to have also. But these are really the critical things that you want. You want the ability for the tool to have automated discovery of internal, external shadow APIs. You want the tool to do security testing by replaying API traffic and not through OpenAPI spec file. Really no reliance on OpenAPI spec file. You don't want the tool to do that. If the tool does that, it's not going to be able to do sophisticated testing. It will only be able to do low-hanging fruits. You want the tool to have out-of-the-box rule set. You really want, you don't want to, write your own test. I mean, you want some customability, but the tool should have a good number of rule sets so that you can just start from day one. You don't have to keep writing and doing pen testing that way. You want the tool to have complete coverage of OWASP API top 10. There are tools which cover injection vulnerabilities. There are tools which can cover SSRF and mass assignment. But you really want this checklist item to be there. OWASP API top 10 has broken authentication, broken authorization, things like sensitive data exposure. You want the tool to have all of those things. Detection of authentication and authorization issues. Now, this, guys, is the hardest for any automated tool to do. But if you're looking for a modern API scanner, the tool should be able to do this. We at Akto have solved this problem. It's a very hard problem to solve. We've solved it. But you want the tool to solve it. Otherwise, you're getting another DAST tool, another traditional DAST tool. You want these issues to be solved. Of course, seamless CI/CD integration, vulnerability reports, very dev-friendly reports, support for these protocols, sensitive data exposure. Now, a lot of times, tools are able to capture, understand what all sensitive data is being exposed. Now, here also, again, the traffic analysis comes into play because a lot of times key names might have, SSN, but the value is not actually taking SSN. So you don't want it to be just on key name. Otherwise, it's a lot of noise. You want it to be based on values as well, and which is what I mean by automatic detection of sensitive data. Compatibility with these authentication methods. Now, I think this is something that I might want to show you also. Most of the times, it's very hard to configure auth token, because auth token is either behind Okta or it's behind social login, or it's like a token coming after a series of API calls. So Akto has both hard-coded and automated auth token generation capabilities. Now, hard-coded will not work if your API token is expiring, had short-lived expiries like 5 minutes, few seconds, or something like that. A lot of our customers use this automated auth token builder. What it does is you have a lot of steps over here. If your token is coming after a series of API calls, you can add those steps over here. You can extract the value of the token at the end of the API call and save it. This way, if your token is coming after a series of API calls, you will be able to automate this token generation, and you don't have to keep supplying the token. The other way is JSON recording. So you can do a complete JSON recording, do these 5 steps, upload it into Akto dashboard. And I think if you're doing, if you have token behind social login, you should be able to automate this complete flow. This way, you don't have to supply auth token to Akto every time you're doing testing. This is a one-time configuration, and you will be able to do authorization, authentication testing just using this automation flow. So this is very, very powerful. This is lacking in most of the API scanning or DAST tools, and this we've built just so that, like the authorization and authentication testing becomes robust using Akto. Right. Yeah, some good to have are some of these things, which these are good, but you want to first check all of these boxes before you go into this box. So yeah. And yeah, before I go into our next set, which is, what does the future looks like? Jim, anything that you think in the checklist that I've missed, you want to add, or you think should not be there, it's like a good to have?
Anything that I can do to help my scanner understand my access control policy is a good thing, because that's just a really hard area of assessment, or being able to handle business logic flaws with more detail. That's some of the more difficult challenges. I think everything else you have on this list is really solid.
Yeah. It's it's the authentication authorization flaws which are very hard to detect, and for that, of course, we've built this capability to find authentication methods in an automated way. What we are also doing is, it's not part of the demo right now, but we're also using LLM models to figure out, some of those API traffic flows and authentication mechanisms and access mechanisms. So if I ask user to add their own authentication mechanisms, it's very hard for the user to also add it. Sometimes they also lack context. Now, because Akto has all the traffic information, Akto can itself do it. So we are figuring out, how to use LLMs to better automate the API scanning workflows.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. All right. I do see some chats.
And Luca suggests automatically constructing an API inventory is something that he'd like to see on the list, is something to look for. Something that Akto does, but other scanners may not.
Yeah, it's there. I think automatic discovery.
Oh, it's number one. Number one, Luca.
Yeah. Oh, it's the number one thing that we do that people really get value out of. Yeah. All right. There is another question, I think.
Yep, that was just Luca making a comment.
Okay. So there
we're doing good.
There are Q&As also. Maybe I'll answer after this. So, okay, so we've talked about traditional DAST, we have talked about modern API scanners, and our customers and people we really talk to every day, AppSec teams, they have this question, what should I do in the next year? What should be like a 3-year strategy, and where is DAST going? Should I have both DAST and API security tool? Should I not have DAST? And can your API security tool replace DAST and all of that? And I think the answer is really looking at the future. Today, these two have similar capabilities, but they're kind of very different also. But in the future, I am very positive. I think both of these will converge into sort of one. The traditional DAST capabilities will become less and less relevant, and API scanning capabilities will become more and more relevant, which means most of the modern API scanners themselves will be able to do a lot of DAST type of testing. So you will not really need a traditional DAST. What you will need is a modern API scanner, which can also do some of the DAST testing. What you want to see, what in the future, it's going to become a lot more into how do we integrate into CI/CD pipelines, because traditional DAST have not been integrating into the CI/CD pipelines. They've been working as standalone tools. But because modern API scanners have the context of traffic, they will have the context of code. It will become extremely important for API scanners to integrate into the DevSecOps pipeline. I think there's this whole bit, which I don't think most of the tech out there is doing right now, but there's this whole bit about how can we do AI-powered testing. It's incredibly powerful. It can really change the way API scanners are working right now. But I think there's not a lot that has been done today, but we're working on it. We're working on something that can really do crazy stuff in AI-powered testing. Still a few months before we can release it, but I think there's a lot that is going to happen in AI-powered testing for any kind of security testing. It doesn't matter. The lines of SAST versus DAST will blur sort of, and you can do so much with just LLMs. And the last one is compliance and regulation. It's always been there. I don't think it's new. It's always been there. DAST has been very important from a compliance standpoint. But I think now API scanning will, it's important for PCI, but it's sort of going to become or sort of replace get added into the DAST category for compliances. So these are the 4 areas where I see the future of DAST and API security go. And I think, Jim, you were saying something about this. Yeah.
Yeah, just DAST in general, it takes a long time to run, and it's really a struggle to wire DAST into an efficient CI/CD pipeline. I was at a conference a while back. I was at a round table, and somebody asked me my opinion on DAST, and I was like, I think DAST is dead in the CI/CD world, in the DevOps world. It just doesn't fit in the DevOps. And like everybody was really quiet all of a sudden. So what I didn't realize is this whole like dinner was sponsored by like 2 different DAST companies. So it was not the most appropriate thing to say in that audience. But it's my belief. It's really hard to run DAST in the CI/CD world.
Yeah.
And anyways, got to be careful who you're saying that in front of, though, Ankita.
Yeah. No, but I agree with you. I think more than dead, it's not really dead, but it's like changing the way it's working, and it's the modern API scanners are taking the role of DAST. It's just hard. We are talking about modern applications over here, which if you run DAST, you will not get some good value out of it, and that's where everyone is coming from, and that's where our conversations is happening. That everyone is trying to move from traditional DAST because they're just not getting that value. So yeah, you're
And
right.
that's ironic. Like the whole industry started with DAST.
Yeah.
That's the original tooling that people were rolling out en masse. I remember like 20 years ago when we're looking at, big application security teams, they're all rolling out all these early stage DAST engines as the heart of their AppSec program. And now 20 years later, I think it's the least effective tool in our tool train. Yeah, Pippin, I didn't mean to say it in front of that audience. I didn't realize who was sponsoring that roundtable. Well, not my most graceful moment. But the era of DAST, I really do think it's coming to an end. And DAST has to migrate into basically API security platforms and embrace a lot of different kind of assessment technology as we see at Akto. I'm a big fan of Akto. That's why I asked to be an advisor. So I'm really happy to be in this webinar and be a part of the Akto team. I really like what Ankita and her team is doing a great deal.
Thank you, Jim. No, thanks for saying all of those things. And we love working with Jim because he has such strong perspective on AppSec. But it's most of the times, I think every time he talks about that, and he's pretty much right there. What he's saying might be strong, but it's true. The DAST tooling right now is moving away to certain other tools. And yeah, I think if Jim is a very good guy to go for, not just API security, but also like, anything around AppSec, and he does advise a lot of other companies as well. So if you have any questions around SAST, DAST, etc., I think Jim is very good person to go to.
And one question from Pippin, she's asking about eBPF, right? Well, this is like deep system monitoring, right? You're talking about like the extended Berkeley packet filter. This is like kernel level monitoring.
Yes.
And the reason that like this technology works well with other assessment technology is because now you're getting like extremely real-time observability that
Yes.
DAST typically is not going to give you. You're literally seeing everything at the kernel level as part of your assessment technology. That's why it's really interesting to see eBPF used in any kind of like real-time assessment technology. There you
Yes.
go, Pippin.
Yes, Jim. Very rightly said. It's capturing all traffic in a raw form, because of which you don't lose traffic. You get all API calls. You understand APIs in depth, which is what companies are trying to do, and that's why eBPF is a very good way, Pippin, to do traffic monitoring, traffic analysis. But at the end of the day, for testing, you still have to run test on those APIs. So yeah, eBPF is the most modern way. I think it's the easiest way also. Most companies are very they're pretty okay using eBPF compared to some of the other connectors. So yeah, that's the way to go for most of the traffic analysis that we do today.
And like I said, other companies are doing things like they're doing network monitoring, or they have like a proxy, and like when you're monitoring the kernel, nothing beats that for observability in terms of the depth of what you're going to see. So
agreed. Yeah, 100%. eBPF is so it just captures all the API traffic, and I think I have a good diagram probably to show you that also. So if you go to eBPF over here, yeah, with Akto, you can see it's like you can literally put eBPF daemon set in every node, and you can capture all the API traffic. These are Akto's runtime services. It will monitor all the traffic, analyze all the traffic, do API discovery, API traffic monitoring, and send it to Akto dashboard. So that's how eBPF is capturing it. I can put this in the chat as well for people to learn how eBPF works. It's really the modern way to work. It's a very hard traffic connector to build. So we're very proud we built it this year, but it's become like our most popular traffic connector since we've built it. All right. Yeah, so I think we are just about there. 45. It was a 45-minute webinar, and we have some questions on chat. Or let's stop sharing because I think there is some Q&A as well, which I can't see unless I stop sharing. Okay, so one of the question is, can you please dive deeper into why DAST needs so much configuration to get it right? Yeah, I think so. Most of the things that I've seen in my experiences, especially the auth token part, the auth token configuration is very, very hard. If you're doing authentication testing, you might need to, automate the auth token, and which the DAST tools normally lack. And that's why the configuration is very, very hard. The second is most of the times companies don't have open API spec file, which a DAST tool sometimes need for API scanning. So that becomes another challenge. The second question is from Farshid. I think modern DAST tools still have some same challenges as traditional DAST. The problem is we need a lot of configuration and auth headers to have a successful scan. These configs and headers are not always set correctly by our devs in CI/CD. And we are not getting valid bugs by integration of DAST. Yeah, so the question, I think I'm going to put it in chat as well. This question is very valid, but the reason why Farshid modern DAST will not have these challenges is it's reading the traffic. It's reading API traffic, which means it has the right information. It's not relying on the open API spec file that the developer has given. Because it has the right information, it's going to really use the traffic information to do the testing. It's not going to have these challenges that, oh, you need some configuration to run it. It really, like, for example, Akto really runs in an automated way. You don't need any configuration except for adding the auth token for authorization testing. Yeah, I think you're really talking about the open API spec file, which for a modern DAST, is not a limitation because it works on traffic and not open API spec file. So I hope I've been able to answer most of the questions. Awesome. Guys, feel free to ask questions in chat, or you can send email also on the questions. There's another question. Can you filter out third-party API endpoints if you're capturing everything? Example, calls to Google. Yes, Luca. And again, eBPF is the way to go for this. eBPF can capture third-party API calls also. It won't be able to give you, of course, a response. But it will tell you there's a call made to Google, there's a call made to Stripe, there's a call made to any other third-party APIs. You of course can't do testing on it because these are third-party APIs, but you can totally get third-party APIs from the eBPF traffic connector. So yeah, I think there's a lot of good questions, especially around the traffic analysis. And if you have more questions around it, I'm sharing my email over here, and you can ask any of the questions over here. You can schedule demo or schedule more conversations if you want to know about how Akto does API scanning. All right, I think we're pretty much done. I'm going to just stop recording.